Good morning. My name is Erin Camper, and I am a parent advisor and trainer at Peak Parent Center. Today, we are going to be doing a back to school overview of the IEP process and developing an IEP. Our objectives today will be to increase your knowledge of special education basics, the evaluation process, eligibility categories, and consent for services, the overall IEP process and the contents of the IEP, delivery of services and supports, the responsibilities of each party, and progress monitoring. We'll also be talking briefly about initial, annual, and triennial meetings, the required IEP team members, excusing members from meetings, amending IEPs, and then a list of resources utilized to put together this presentation. So what is an IEP? I often hear it called an individualized education plan. In reality, it is an individualized education program, and I have highlighted individualized here because that is one of the most important parts, that each program is highly individualized to the student that it is being designed for. It is a legal document, a contract, if you will, that describes how the student is functioning in the general education curriculum and what a student will learn by when, through services delivered by whom, in which setting, which means special education or general education, or where, and when well used, it is a growth plan for the student. It is a plan for them to access the general education curriculum and make meaningful progress. This is a working document driven by data. It can be modified and changed as needed within the context of an IEP meeting with rare exceptions. We often place so much pressure and importance on the actual annual meeting, which it is very important, but it's also important to remember that it is not written in stone. And we should be continually looking at the IEP program and determining if it is effective, if the student is making progress, or if they've made so much progress that we need to reconvene and make new goals. Parents can call a meeting at any time during the year if things are not working, or if the student has made so much progress that new goals need to be made. IEPs exist because of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a law that makes available a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, which is a term you'll frequently hear, to eligible children with disabilities throughout the nation and ensures special education and related services to those children. Related services is all of those other pieces that children may need: occupational therapy, physical therapy, transportation, vision services, etc. The IDEA governs how states and public agencies provide early intervention, special education, and related services to more than 7.5 million, as of the school year 2021, eligible infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities. IDEA is the federal law, and then each state also has their own laws, which must be at least as strong as the federal laws, but can be even stronger. Special education is the specially designed instruction that addresses the unique needs of eligible students. Special education is provided at no cost to parents and includes those related services like we spoke about that a student needs to access his or her educational program. The reason that this law exists is because disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving the educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. FAPE and LRE are two acronyms that you'll hear frequently within the world of disability and special education. IDEA includes two fundamental requirements, FAPE and LRE. And that means that the child will receive a free, appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, or LRE. We often hear the word inclusion, and Peak Parent Center is passionate about inclusion of children with disabilities as much as possible in both their education and all other areas of life. Inclusion is not a word that is actually included in IDEA, but this concept of least restrictive environment equates to inclusion. Children being educated to the highest extent possible with their non-disabled peers. FAPE, or a free appropriate public education, is determined on an individual basis. There's that individual again. It requires that educational and related services are provided at public expense, free, under public supervision and direction without charge to the student or families. They meet the standards of the state educational agency. So they're meeting the same standards that all general education students are required to meet, and include an appropriate preschool, elementary, or secondary school education provided in accordance with the IEP. So this applies to those areas of schooling from preschool all the way through high school graduation and into those transition services for some students. LRE, or the least restrictive environment, means that a child with a disability must be educated within the same classroom as non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible. LRE isn't a place, it's a principle that guides a child's education program. And this is equivalent to that word inclusion that we are very passionate about. We're very passionate about the theory of inclusion and the practice of meaningful inclusion, which in the law is called the least restrictive environment. FAPE in the LRE. So that free and appropriate public education needs to take place in the LRE, the least restrictive environment. So at the center is the general ed curriculum, and all students are general education students first. Special education and supports wraps around the general ed curriculum, and then those related services like OT, PT, speech, vision services, transportation, all of those things then wrap around special education and general ed to make sure that that student has access to their education and a chance to make meaningful progress. Andrew F. is a very important case that came out of the state of Colorado that really defined a new standard for FAPE. Prior to Andrew F., the standard for FAPE was that a child make more than merely de minimis progress, which is pretty vague and also not very ambitious. Andrew F. went all the way to the Supreme Court and set a new standard for FAPE. To meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress and appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Still a little bit gray and vague, but much more ambitious. And everything in IDEA is a little vague because it's all meant to be individualized. So this really just says we should be looking at these children as individuals and making sure that they're making progress appropriate for their specific circumstances, but it should be meaningful and it should be ambitious. So on to the steps in the process of the IEP. First, we have the referral, then the evaluation, and then the determination of eligibility. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. So referral for evaluation happens when a child is known to have or is suspected to have a disability. A referral should be made to the special education team, and an evaluation should take place and should address every area of concern for that child. The school can only refuse to evaluate if there is no evidence the child has a disability, and that must be sent to the parent in a prior written notice and detail the reasons why there is no suspicion of disability. This should be a rare case. The referral must happen before a child enters a special education system, not more than once a year unless the school and the parent agree, and once every 3 years unless the parent and school agree it is not needed. So there's the initial evaluation, the annual evaluation, and the triennial or every 3-year evaluation. How is an evaluation requested? The school may recommend that a student be evaluated. Other providers who work with the student, such as a doctor or therapist, may recommend that the student be evaluated, and parents may request an evaluation. Informed parent consent is required for that evaluation to take place. A school must notify parents and describe procedures and obtain written consent before the evaluation process begins. They must use a variety of assessment tools to determine if a child has a disability under IDEA, and we'll talk about those categories. It must go over the contents of the IEP, and it cannot be discriminatory or have racial or cultural biases. And parents should be given a copy of any evaluation reports. I have asked in the past to go over those evaluation reports prior to the annual IEP, just because it takes a long time and it's sometimes hard to hear about all of your child's deficits. And I like to, kind of get that over with before going into the IEP meeting. This is not a requirement of the school. However, it is something you can ask for, and it can be helpful. Either way, you should receive those reports. The child must be evaluated in all areas related to the suspected disability, including, if appropriate, health, vision and hearing, social and emotional functioning, general intelligence, academic performance, communicative status, and motor abilities. And that vision and hearing piece can be really important because we want to make sure that those things aren't affecting the child's ability to learn, and maybe simply correcting those is all they really need. I was previously a school nurse, and in our district, the vision and hearing screening results from those school screenings had to be sent to the special ed manager before the IEP, just to make sure that the student didn't have any concerns for vision or hearing before they got further into the process. Types of assessment tools. So the evaluation must use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant functional, developmental, and academic information about the child, including information provided by the parent. Assessment tools might include formal standardized tests of intelligence or academic achievement, informal assessments such as classroom and parent observations, behavior rating scales, skills checklists, samples of work, and input from other professionals, both inside and outside of the school district. It is required that the team consider input from outside professionals. They don't have to necessarily act on that input, but they do have to consider it. So this is just kind of a graphic showing areas of evaluation, and that should be a cyclical probing model, looking at all of these areas, asking questions, considering different things, just really good overall assessment, looking at all kinds of areas and being really thorough. Evaluation reports should be reported in a variety of ways, including standard scores, percentile ranks, age or grade equivalents, and it can be helpful to be aware of the normal distribution curve or bell curve. Scores based on the bell curve report are reported as standard scores and percentile ranks. However, it is important to be aware that there isn't one specific percentile rank that is required for a student to qualify for special education. There is a variety of factors determining if they need special education. Parents and school staff decide if, because of the disability, there is a need for special education and related services. There must be evidence of educational impact. So there can be students who have a disability who do not need special education because it does not have a direct educational impact. And the child cannot be determined to have a disability because of a lack of appropriate instruction or limited English proficiency. So, for example, after the pandemic, when there were many students who did not have access to their education, or not enough or appropriate access to their education because they didn't have a parent home to make sure that they were accessing that virtual education, things like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean those children had a disability. And there are other ways to address those areas, such as MTSS and RTI, intervention type things. MTSS is multi-tiered systems of support, and RTI is response to intervention. So it's intervention that is not special education, and that might be appropriate for students who have had a lack of appropriate instruction due to the pandemic, or they were homeless and not attending school, things like that. Same for limited English proficiency. That's another challenge that needs to be addressed for those English language learners. However, that is not a disability. That is a separate challenge that is addressed in a different way. And obviously you can have a child who's an English language learner who does have a disability and needs special education. So each of those needs would need to be addressed. And the state of Colorado has eligibility requirements for each category, and the team will go over those to determine if the child is eligible in that category, but it's not one specific thing like they have an F or they're in the 10th percentile. It's looking at a variety of categories to determine if the student is indeed eligible and needing special education. Categories here: autism, deaf blindness, which is obviously a category that has very specific needs for that student. Deafness. Developmental delay can be utilized through the 8th birthday. After that, it has to be changed to a new category. Emotional disturbance. In our district, it's called SED, severe emotional disturbance. Hearing impairment. Intellectual disability. Intellectual disability may be what developmental delay is changed to if that delay continues on past that age of 8. Multiple disabilities must include an intellectual disability and any other on this category, any other from this list. Orthopedic impairment could be something like cerebral palsy or any other impairment that affects the body physically. Other health impairment is a more broad category. Things like ADHD fall under here. Also, if a child has seizures that affect their ability to access their education, that could fall under health impairment. Specific learning disability. This is where things like dyslexia would fall under this and would be labeled as specific learning disability in literacy. Speech or language impairment, and this is the only one where the student can be on an IEP and receiving only the related service and not receiving special education. So they can be receiving only speech services and not special education, and that's the only eligibility category where that can happen. Every other category, they must be receiving special education services. Speech or language impairment also is one of the most common categories, and also a category where fortunately students are often able to graduate off of the IEP because the delay or impairment is addressed and the student no longer needs those services after a certain point. Traumatic brain injury and visual impairment, including blindness, are all eligibility categories. So within 30 days of completing the evaluation, an IEP meeting occurs, and within the meeting, the IEP is written, determining the child's needs and eligibility. So sometimes there might be an eligibility meeting and then another meeting to write the actual IEP. Frequently, if the student is eligible, they're just going to have that eligibility meeting and the initial IEP meeting together at the same time, which makes more sense because there's not a ton to say about the eligibility. If they're eligible, they're going to go over why and then move into writing the IEP most times. Required team members, parents the law says that there needs to be a reasonable attempt made to include the parents. If a reasonable attempt, which is kind of gray, is made to include the parents and they are unable to attend, the meeting can move forward without them. However, we'll talk about special education services cannot be put in place without parental consent. So really, it's not the best idea to move forward without parents unless it's a really desperate situation. Not less than one regular or general education teacher, and this needs to be a teacher who teaches the student. In elementary, it's going to be the homeroom teacher. And then in secondary, middle school, and high school, one of the students' multiple teachers, someone who actually teaches them. And then not less than one special education teacher. And the only really exception to this is in the state of Colorado, preschool teachers are generally both the special ed teacher and the general ed teacher. And in that situation, they can fill both of those roles. A school district representative, and this is somebody who is able to make decisions regarding finance and things like that. A person to explain the evaluation results. This is often the school psychologist. The special ed teacher may be able to explain some of those, and it doesn't have to be the person who did the evaluation, but it does have to be somebody who understands the evaluation and can explain those results. Optional team members, these are only the related services staff are only optional in that they only need to be there if the child has those services. So you don't need a PT there if the child does not receive PT services. However, any services that that child does receive, occupational therapy, physical therapy, vision services, speech therapy, those things, any service provider who is on the student's IEP provides those services does need to be in the IEP meeting. Any others who know the student, parents are allowed and encouraged to bring anyone they want to an IEP that knows the student well. That could be an outside therapist, that could be grandma, that could be mom's best friend. If mom is single or dad is unable to attend and mom just needs some support, somebody who knows her and knows the student well, that could be an advocate if needed. I'll talk a little bit about facilitation. If facilitation through the Colorado Department of Education is going to happen, that does need to be agreed upon by both parties and then the student as appropriate. And we always really encourage involving students as early as possible based on their disabilities and their personality. When they're really young, they could even come and just introduce themselves and say, my name is so-and-so, and I love trains and whales, and I love math, just so that there's always a reminder of why we're there. The focus is on the student, and there's a phrase, nothing about us without us. So as much as possible, we should be including the person with a disability as we're making plans for their education. And as they get older, there's also student-led IEPs where the student actually is the one running the meeting and in charge of basically in charge of the process, which is really powerful and really beneficial. So this is just a circular graphic, which I really like because it's not an us against them. We're all on the same team. And I really encourage teams as much as possible to set up the room in a circular manner. No parent wants to be sitting on one side of a table with 13 professionals on the other side of the table. It's really divisive, doesn't make for a good feeling. So setting the room up so everyone's sort of in an equal position, if at all possible, is actually really powerful. Team members may be excused, but this should be a rare exception. So if that member's area of the curriculum is not being changed or discussed, and if the parent and school district agree in writing before the meeting. So you can't just show up to a meeting and a team member has been excused and the parent hasn't agreed to it and it hasn't been agreed on in writing. If a member's area of curriculum is being discussed and instead of attending, they can give a written report before the IEP meeting. Again, if the parent consents in writing and the school agrees. Alternatives to this in the day and age of Zoom and Teams and all the things. If a team member is not able to attend in person because they had an IEP across the district right before, which happens because many of the service providers are what we call itinerant, and they move from school to school throughout the day and throughout the week. They can be zoomed into the meeting. There's alternatives like that just to make sure every member is there, and they need to be there for the whole entire meeting. So the gen ed teacher can't leave after they think they're done. The service providers can't leave when they think their part is done. Every member needs to remain in the meeting for the whole time unless it's agreed in writing before the meeting by the school and the parent. And carefully consider before agreeing to excuse IEP team members. This is the one chance during the year for everyone to all get together and be on the same page and make a really great program for the student with a disability. So do everything possible to make sure that all team members are there for the entirety of the meeting. Notice of meeting. So before the IEP meeting, parents must be given notice, which includes the purpose, time, and place of the meeting, who will be attending. The parents may invite others, and it is courtesy to let the school know beforehand who you're going to bring. Again, if you do opt for a facilitator through the Colorado Department of Education, that does need to be decided upon by both the school and the family or caregiver. And the notice must be translated into the language spoken in the family's home. Most schools have an IEP software that has an option to generate the notice of meeting that will be sent home. So just some general tips. Communication. One thing I think I forgot to mention is if the parent is requesting the evaluation for IEP, make sure that it's done in writing and that is email, because then you have a paper trail of the time and the date that evaluation was requested. Have good communication with your school throughout the year. In the IEP meeting, you will make a plan about communication and make sure that that's done. I get an email every Friday from my son's teacher about what his week looked like. We have a communication binder that goes back and forth so that I know what his day looks like. So when we get to the IEP meeting, nothing is like a big shock, like, oh, this has been going on, or we've been making no progress in this area. Everything is in my mind. It's been communicated, and I've been communicating back and forth with them as well. Building relationships. Teachers don't go into the field to make money or for the glamour. They go into it to help kids. And sometimes, I mean, obviously there are issues and things can get in the way, but try to get to know them, build relationships. I bring cookies to IEP meetings just to kind of start it off with a, hey, you know, this isn't a big ugly thing. We're all here together to talk about this child, and, you know, let's enjoy a cookie and let's talk about the progress he's made. And I remember that his special ed teacher is gluten-free, and I remember that his PT is gluten-free. So I remember important things about them, just like they remember important things about my son. Monitor emotions. Oh, no parent loves to go to an IEP meeting. It's super emotional. We're talking about all of our child's deficits, and it's not always the most fun. But if everybody can remember why we're there and really focus on, you know, the needs of the child, the legal rights of the child, and that we're all there to help that child, and try to keep those emotions in check as much as possible, which is sometimes easier said than done. But of course, it always goes smoother if everybody can do that as best as possible. And there's a great resource from Cadre called Steps to Success, communicating with your child's school, and there's a link on the resource page at the end of the presentation. So contents of the IEP. We're going to talk about each of these in detail, but it begins with the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, or this fun acronym, PLAPF. Measurable annual goals, description of how the child's progress toward meeting the annual goals will be measured, statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services, modifications and accommodations, an explanation of the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular class and in extracurricular and non-academic activities, the projected date for the beginning of the services and modifications, and the anticipated frequency, location, and duration of those services and modifications. So the minutes and where those are going to happen. PLAPF, or present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. This should include the student's strengths, preferences, and interests. And this is a great area for parents to give their input about those things, because it's great, first of all, to focus on the child's strengths, start things off positive, and then also talk about their preferences and interests, because we can use those towards their goals. Present levels of educational performance. So that's really going to be from the evaluation and assessments. Where are they currently? And then the needs and impact of their disability on their education, and then parent and student input. And this is really important. There are many input forms out there. There's some on the CDE webpage, Colorado Department of Education. There's, if you Google, you can find them. Our special ed teacher sends it home about a week or two before the IEP. And we get to put everything in there. Our hopes and dreams for our son, goals we want to work on, what we see as his strengths, what we see as the biggest areas of need that we want to work on. And that goes directly into this area of the IEP. And if the student is old enough, they should be able to have some say and put their input in as well. Make sure strengths are listed in the IEP and utilized throughout the IEP. Again, the IEP is really deficit focused, but make sure that the team is talking about those strengths and putting them in throughout the IEP and talking about how those can be utilized to reach goals. Example, Mario enjoys reading chapter books. He prefers books about sports. He likes to write mystery stories. He learns well in cooperative groups. He can remember information he has heard. And Mario is in the video club at school. He takes karate lessons. So lots of stuff here that we can use to motivate Mario, to help him reach his goals, to help keep him engaged in school, things like that. So the needs and impact of disability. So for example, Mario needs to fluently decode words with more than 3 syllables is a good way to state the impact of disability. Mario needs to read at grade level. That's not nearly specific enough. Another good example, Jamie needs opportunities to communicate and engage in age-appropriate activities with non-disabled peers, which is much better than just saying Jamie needs friends, because yes, we all need friends. Jamie needs friends, but how does her disability impact her ability to make friends, and how do we address that? Consideration of special factors. So does the student exhibit behavior that requires a behavior intervention plan? This is really important, and this has been a really big issue recently with students having not been in school for an extended period of time and relearning how to be a student, all of the stress in the world and things like that. Behavior has been a big concern and definitely needs to be addressed as part of the IEP for children who this is part of their disability, and those other factors are making it more prevalent. We need to really make sure we're addressing that. Is the student blind or visually impaired? Does the student have communication needs? Are they verbal? Are they nonverbal? Do they use an AAC device? Are they deaf or hard of hearing? Do they need an interpreter? Are they deaf-blind? Again, we mentioned earlier that's obviously a very challenging disability, and that needs to be addressed by very specific professionals and very specific ways of learning. Does the student require a health plan? So if the student has medical needs, they may have a healthcare action plan that is written by the school nurse and the child's physician, for example, a seizure action plan, a plan for a student with diabetes. And the IEP would just state that that student has a healthcare action plan, and it needs to be, of course, known by everybody who's taking care of the student as well. It's kind of an extension of the IEP. Does the student have limited English proficiency? Like we talked about earlier, that is obviously not a disability. It's a challenge that needs to be addressed, especially if the student also has a disability. Does the student need assistive technology or devices? And this can encompass all kinds of things. Do they need an FM system for the teacher to be able to project their voice, for the child to be able to hear them? Do they have a talking device? Do they have a wheelchair? This can apply to all different kinds of things. And then does the student require special transportation? So transportation is a related service, and that does need to be addressed within the IEP. Annual goals. IDEA requires measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals designed to meet the child's needs that result from his or her disability. These are so the student can be involved and make progress in the general education curricula and meet other educational needs that result from the disability, and they need to be measurable. There's also been a lot of talk lately about not only measurable, but meaningful, and really looking at a holistic, sort of futuristic way of looking at these. Why do we have these goals? What's the long-term plan? Are they functional? Are they, meaningful? Things like that. So they need to have the who, which is the student, what will they do, the behavior, to what level or degree, the criterion, under what conditions, and in what length of time, which is typically 1 year. Unless the student is on extended evidence outcomes, which is a small percentage of students, and their goals must have short-term goals within them. Any other student, it must be 1 year, and it can be shorter goals, working towards that bigger goal, but it's not a requirement. So we've probably all heard of SMART goals. They're used in all kinds of industries. I'm also a nurse, and we use them in nursing. And it's just an acronym to kind of help people remember, what we want in our goals. And we want them to be specific. We want them to be measurable so that they're able to be counted or observed. We want them to be attainable, including action words. Realistic and relevant to address the individual needs, like I was just talking about, and time limited, which is generally that 1 year until we do that annual evaluation. So here's an example of an annual goal. The need is that Mario needs to fluently decode words with more than 1 syllable. The goal is that Mario will read a 5th grade text with 95% accuracy at a rate of 75 words per minute. And Mario's current baseline, Mario reads 3rd grade text with 97% accuracy at a rate of 68 words per minute. So there's nobody here to talk to me because I'm on my own, but I'll just talk through these. Are these measurable? Mario will improve his writing skills. This will be measured by teacher observation. No, that is not a specific way to measure. Monica will learn multiplication facts 0 through 12. This will be measured by written and oral testing. This one's a little bit better, but what do we consider? What percentage are we looking for? Are we looking for 80% accuracy? How often? Things like that. John will improve his ability to stay on task and pay attention. This will be measured by teacher observation. Again, very vague, not really measurable. Short-term objectives, like I mentioned briefly, these are required only for students that take alternate assessments aligned to alternate achievement standards. I need to change this because it's alternate. So this is for a small percentage of students with significant cognitive disabilities who have a separate set of standards and are taking those alternate assessments. You can ask the IEP team to write short-term objectives if your student is not on those EEOs in order to have a clear roadmap of steps to reaching annual goals. However, it is not a requirement. Progress monitoring is another part of the IEP, and this is super important because we need to know how will the child's progress be measured, when will it be measured, and by whom? How often will parents receive a progress report? And this should be no less often than general ed students. So if there's a progress report going home for general ed students, a student on an IEP should also be receiving a progress report. And that annual IEP meeting does count as a progress report or an update. And then how will that report be delivered? Does that come in an encrypted email? Is it sent home with the student in a sealed envelope? Will it go in the snail mail? Just talk about how that will be sent home so parents know where to be looking for that. And each person on the team is responsible for monitoring their area, obviously. And then the general academics would be shared between the general ed teacher and the special ed teacher, and there should be a conversation about exactly what each of those teachers would be monitoring. So now we're going to talk about supports within the IEP. So the first thing we're going to talk about is accommodations, which change how a student receives instruction or shows what they have learned. And these are needed to participate in all general education activities and extracurricular activities. So anything sponsored by the school, sports, field trips, after school clubs that are school sponsored, the IEP and the accommodations and modifications apply to those as well. And accommodations for state and district assessments should be documented as well. And for some specific assessments, there are guidelines from the companies that produce those assessments that are listed. So that should be a discussion in the IEP as appropriate as well. So modifications actually change what the student learns. These are needed to participate in all general education activities and extracurricular activities again. And if the student requires modifications to state standards, that student may require alternate assessments. That's the EEOs that we were talking about. Those students on those standards do not take the same assessments as every other student, like CMAS and those type of things. They take it's called co-alt, a different modified test. And there is a new requirement to document that parents understand the implications of alternate assessment. Basically, it's very challenging to be on a diploma track for students who are on that alternate assessment or EEOs, and parents need to be aware of that, and needs to be a very thorough and clear discussion with the IEP team before a student is placed on those standards and those alternate assessments. So it can get a little muddy and confusing between accommodations and modifications. So for example, an accommodation would be that a student would be able to use a calculator on a math test. A modification would be that the class is doing division and the student on an IEP is not able to do the division yet, so they're working on the level of math that they're currently at. A little more nuanced than that, but basically accommodations change how the student is learning, like I said, and the modifications change what they're learning. So there's actual modifications or changes to the curriculum versus just things put in place to help that student learn, like extended time, calculator, being able to sit on a yoga ball, things like that. Accommodations is wide and lots of options, and modifications is more specific and must be done within the context of an IEP. Accommodations can be put in a 504. Service delivery. So this is the date the services and modifications will start, how often, the location, and the duration. And this needs to be adequate to meet the student's needs and can result in a child reaching his or her goals. So this cannot be determined based on how many minutes the occupational therapist has left in their week. The school is not allowed to say or able to say, well, the OT has 10 minutes once a week, so that's what the student is going to get. The amount needs to be what the student needs, that the team decides on, that is appropriate for them and their circumstance in order to help them reach their goal. Extended school year, or ESY. Some students with IEPs will be eligible for extended school year, which are special education and related services that are provided beyond the normal school year, often in the summer, typically in the summer, in accordance with the child's IEP and at no cost to the parents. Determination of eligibility for extended school year services is decided by looking at regression and recoupment data collected after school breaks, as well as predictive factors. So if the student has shown that they regress significantly after school breaks and take a decent amount of time to recoup what they have lost, that's one factor that they're looking at. And then there's predictive factors. If students have certain things, like, for example, my son requires vision services, and that isn't something that we can provide as a family outside of the school district, and therefore he qualifies for ESY for in one way, just because he needs to continue to receive those vision services, because we can predict that without those vision services over the summer that we are unable to provide as a family, simply because private vision services don't really exist, that he would have regression and recoupment issues. Alternate assessments. So this is what I talked about a little bit before, and this is for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. The IEP team, which includes the parents, may determine that the student qualifies for alternate assessments, and the parents must be informed about the difference between regular and alternate assessments and the effects of these, which we already talked about. Here's my favorite: LRE, least restrictive environment. IDEA provides that a student with a disability must be educated with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. The IEP must include an explanation of the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular class and the extracurricular and non-academic activities. So again, we're still going through the contents of the IEP. There is a portion of the IEP called LRE, and we are assuming that we are going to start with general education to the maximum extent possible and work our way out from there if needed. Placement refers to the services that the student will receive and the educational environment. This is super confusing and often gets muddled up because we think placement sounds like which school they're going to go to, but placement really refers to gen ed versus pull out in a special classroom. So this portion is going to talk about how much of the day is a student going to be spending in the gen ed class with their typical peers versus how much they would be pulled out to the special ed classroom or to another room to work with a special ed provider or related service provider. And then the location is actually the physical location where the services will be provided, which generally refers to which school. I wish that they would rename these because it can be very confusing for sure. Accessible instructional materials. IDEA requires school districts to provide accessible versions of instructional materials to students who are blind or otherwise unable to use printed materials. And this needs to happen in a timely manner. And schools need to take reasonable steps to provide these materials at the same time other children receive their instructional materials. So, for example, if a child is blind and needs Braille, there needs to be steps taken to make sure that that student has that book at the same time that the gen ed students are beginning to read that book. Obviously, that's super important so that they can be a part of that gen ed curriculum. And this is a lot easier than it used to be because of so many electronic options and versions. It's a lot easier just to download software for a lot of these things. But if they do need something, a physical copy, like a Braille book or something like that, they need to receive that in a timely manner, as close as possible to when the other students are starting that lesson. Prior written notice is a not talked about enough piece of IDEA that is kind of confusing. The wording is confusing again, so many confusing words within the law. But basically, parents must receive prior written notice in writing from the school each time that the school proposes or refuses to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of your child. So if they're going to change that percentage of gen ed versus special education pullout, that needs to be done in prior written notice, and also within the context of an IEP meeting. And anytime the school proposes or refuses to initiate or change the provision of FAPE to your child, basically anytime changes are made that are more than just minor little changes, that needs to be documented in a prior written notice. And again, most schools and districts have a software program that has an embedded prior written notice that they can utilize. Sorry, my cat is joining me, thinks he needs to be a part of this today. Oh, and there's a typo. I need to fix this slide. Amending the IEP. So IDEA 2004 allows for an IEP to be amended and modified without the complete IEP team. This should be a rare exception and only utilized for small changes. If the parent and school both agree, the parents need to be involved and help write amendments, and the IEP team, meaning all the members, need to be informed of the changes, and parents may have to request a copy of the IEP with amendments. Everyone serving the child needs a copy of the amendments as well, so they know those changes have been made. This would be only for really small changes to the IEP. For example, we added a transportation plan to my son's IEP, and we made an amendment to the IEP that said child has a transportation plan. And then we wrote the transportation plan, but we didn't do that within the context of an IEP meeting. So small changes like that. And carefully consider before agreeing to amend an IEP without all the team members. Again, we want to make sure everybody on that meeting knows that changes are being made. We want everybody to be on the same page. We want everybody to have input. So unless it's a very small change, we want to make sure that we do that within the context of a meeting, which can happen at any time during the year, as we talked about earlier. Parent participation. So parents are team members. They're a very important member of the team. They're equal participants in the team process. Parents are the protectors of the student's IDEA rights. So the more you know about your child's rights, the better, which is a lot of what we're going over today. However, the school has the legal obligation to propose an IEP that provides a free and appropriate public education. And parents do have a right to object to the school's proposal. So if you disagree with the IEP, there are steps that you can take. You can ask to reconvene and hold the meeting again, and try to come to an agreement. You can add some time to the meeting until everyone can agree. There are lots of options if you don't agree to the school's proposal, which is kind of a whole separate topic, but you do not have to agree to everything at that meeting. But hopefully, if everybody's communicating and working together, hopefully everyone can agree to a program, an IEP that is beneficial and going to be effective for the child within the context of that annual meeting. Consent for services. So parents' permission is needed before an initial special education and related services, before those are put in place. If the parent refuses services, the district cannot use due process to get consent. That's the end of it. The school cannot provide those services. And parents can revoke consent for special education and related services. I was really wondering when this would ever actually take place. And I had an example from my own life and somebody that I know. My friend has a son who is a freshman in high school, and he wants to go to West Point Army Academy, and they do not accept students who are on an IEP, which is a discussion for a different day. But her son really wants to go there. Her husband went there and is an Army Ranger and a lifelong Army high up officer. So they revoked consent for special education, and her son is doing well, utilizing the things that he learned along the way. So that is an example of when that might happen. So delivery of services and supports after an initial IEP is written and placement is determined. So how much time in gen ed versus how much time pulled out. The district is required to deliver the special education and related services outlined in the IEP as soon as possible. Generally should be happening the next day. There cannot be undue delay in providing services to the student. The general education and special education teachers share responsibility for implementing the IEP. This is really important. Related and support service providers are responsible for implementation if they are defined in the IEP. And all team members are responsible for continually evaluating the effectiveness of the plan. Following an eligibility determination, it is expected that the IEP of a child with disability will be implemented as soon as possible following the IEP meeting. Possible exceptions would be if the meeting occurs during the summer or during a vacation, and no services are required during that period, or if there are circumstances that require a short delay, working out transportation arrangements, ordering a piece of equipment, ordering a software program, things like that. But that should happen as quickly as possible. So school district's responsibilities are collaboration and communication taking place among the IEP team, including parents and students. Copies of the IEP being disseminated to those responsible for implementing a student's IEP. So that would be all of the service providers, and then all of the students' teachers, both their gen ed teachers and special ed teachers. Services are provided as planned and documented on the IEP. Services reflect the IEP goals. So the services are addressing those goals and working towards them. The student's progress toward goals is monitored. And like we talked about, everybody is monitoring their area, and the special ed teachers and gen ed teachers are sharing that responsibility of monitoring those kind of general academic goals. Outside agencies, which are to provide transition services, are monitored. This is applicable to students who are transitioning from high school into those adult services called transition services between the ages of 18 and 21, which again is a separate topic for a separate day. We do have information about that. Periodic review takes place as scheduled, and it must be at least once every year. Progress monitoring is the ongoing process of collecting and analyzing data to determine student progress. That's pretty self-explanatory. It should be used to make instructional and service decisions based on the student's performance. It is the responsibility of the IEP team. At the time an IEP is developed, it must specify and document plans for progress monitoring, which we talked a little bit about earlier. What will be monitored, who will be monitoring, when and where the monitoring will be conducted, and how that data will be reported out. And this, a whole point of this is to provide data to assist in making decisions about students, to guide instructional decisions, and to provide data on student performance to determine that PLAPs, like we talked about, their current level of learning, behavior, performance, and to measure and report progress towards goals and objectives and outcomes. There's no point in having an IEP if we don't know if it's working. So obviously progress monitoring is super important. Benefits are parents and students know what is expected. Teachers have an organized record of the student's performance. Teachers know what is working or not working with their instruction based on data. And this is an easy to understand way to show parents the progress. IEP teams have comprehensive data on student performance for decision-making. So I mentioned earlier IEP facilitation. So if meetings are not going well, if things feel contentious or things feel like they're not running as they should, you can request an impartial IEP facilitator through the Colorado Department of Education. This is an impartial third party who is trained in the skills of facilitating, and they can come to a meeting and make sure that it is run smoothly, that everybody has a voice. They will chart out what is being said, so that everybody can see what is being said and there's a record of everything. And this is kind of a project between Peak Parent Center and the Colorado Department of Education to help prevent families and IEP teams get to what we call dispute resolution, which does happen where things just can't be worked out. But this is a step to take before that happens, and it's often very effective in getting teams and families to work together towards a common goal. Those dispute resolution options, which are generally the last resort. Obviously, you want to work with the school as much as possible. Your student is there. They're usually going to be there for several years. You want to have a good relationship with that team. Always try working with them first. Try the facilitation if needed. And if all else fails, options for dispute resolution include mediation, resolution meeting, due process hearing, formal complaint to CDE. All of these, there's information on the Colorado Department of Education website. If it gets to this, a parent advisor can help you figure out how to do this or who to go to for help to do this. But again, last resort, hopefully we can solve issues before we get here. And then here's some of our resources, including that Cadre Steps to Success, which is a great resource about communicating with your schools. And if you have specific questions about your child's IEP or their rights, please contact a parent advisor. We can be reached by phone or email, and we exist to help parents understand their child's rights, figure out next steps in the IEP process, things like that. Refer you to other resources if we don't know the answer or you need a different resource. And hopefully this helped as a very, very broad overview of the IEP process. We have other recorded webinars and offer live webinars from time to time about a variety of special ed and IEP topics. So look for those. Follow us on social media. We post our new webinars as they are offered, and also share a lot of resources from other great organizations so that you can become more and more educated about IDEA and your child's rights, and effectively advocate for them within your school. So thank you and have a great day.